For scene 1, I'll start by adding in some water for the ocean and dialing in the lighting so that it feels cold and overcast. Then I'll add placeholders for the stronghold and the cliff I wanted to be on, as well as some more land on the right side that's going to be overgrown with trees. I'm trying to get all my experimentation out of the way at this stage of the process, because later it's gonna take way longer to make any of these kinds of changes. So once I'm happy with the layout, I can focus on making all the individual elements look nice instead of still having to worry about the composition of the scene. So the first thing I'll replace is the stronghold. With plenty of reference in hand, I'll start adding an outer wall, a large main house, and a lot of round and rectangular towers. I found that in the references, the strongholds just seem like this random collection of towers and houses, so that's the feeling I'm trying to replicate. I'll also add a lot of windows and details that I think are going to be visible from the camera. So I'm not going insanely detailed here, but hopefully detailed enough for the distance the camera is going to be at. I don't really know why, but in the reference images, the towers had a lot of completely random windows, so I'm adding those as well as these crenulated ramparts, and of course an entrance to the castle as well. Then I quickly import the castle into the main scene to test if it fits. I think it does, so I'll go back into the castle file and continue adding details. Then moving on to the texture, for which I'll mix together multiple different brick and castle wall textures from Polyhaven, as well as adding some moss into the crevices of that texture to give it a more worn and older feeling. Since the scene I'm making is pretty dark, I also added a bit of light behind some of the windows, just so that the castle seems a bit more alive. Now for the cliff the castle is standing on, I first sculpted it into a rough cliff shape. This alone isn't really enough to sell the cliff look though, so what I would normally do is to try to work with a lot of displacement and different textures to give it that rugged, rocky look, but in my experience that is pretty hard and doesn't work that well. So what I'll do instead is to use a few 3D scans of cliff faces and rocks and place them around and on top of the base I sculpted. The only disadvantage is that it's a lot heavier performance-wise than just a texture. Another thing I had to do is to adjust the color of the 3D scans, because since they are taken from a lot of different places and rock types, they don't match at all. Something that I really wanted to do is to make it feel like the stronghold wasn't just set on top of the cliff, but it's like really built into that cliff. And the way I did that is to place some of 3D scans on top of the cliff and making them kind of hug the side of the castle, which you can see sells that look that the castle was built for that cliff and not just added as an afterthought. And I do feel like that's the way it would be in real life. For the cliff on the side, I take my blockout that I made with cubes and sculpt it into more of a cliff shape. I don't really care if it still looks very blocky, which it definitely did even after sculpting, because I don't think it'll be that visible from the camera. I just care about that slope towards the stronghold and that rocky cliff feeling. I ideally would have also used that placing 3D scans of rocks method, but this cliff is just so large that that's completely impossible, on my machine at least. So what I'll have to do instead is to fall back on my texture and a lot of displacement method, which is okay because it's not the focal point anyways. And once I scattered some trees on top using geometry nodes, it wasn't really looking that good. To fix that, I had to do a couple of things. The first one is that I also had to have the trees grow on this part that slopes down in the foreground, as well as having some dirt on top of the cliff and keeping the rock constrained to only the sides. This was better, but still not enough. So what I did next is to add some shrubs below the trees, as well as adding some fog to give the trees a bit more depth. Right now the background looks pretty empty and thus fake. So what I do is to place an image of some clouds, and that looks a lot better already. Next, I felt that there was a lot of empty space on the right and left side, so I'll place some trees that are barely visible, and that looks a lot better in my opinion. Maybe a bit cliche, but I like these nice leading lines that it also creates. And while I'm on the foreground, I'll also add a bit of a camera movement, as well as adding some more irregularities to the ground, some rocks, some grass, shrubs, and tree stumps. At first, the color of them was standing out in a negative way, but that's pretty common when using pre-made assets. So what I always do to fix that is to use hue saturation value nodes to match their color to better fit into the scene. The path was a bit of a struggle to get looking right, but in the end I just had to replace the texture with a more foresty one and also scatter some pebbles on it. The grass and shrubs don't really match the vibe of the scene and don't look the highest quality, so I replaced them with some better ones from the Botany Library, which leveled up the look it had quite a bit, I gotta say. For the bridge, I'll create this large arc and connect the upper part to it using these odd-shaped cubes, because that's just the way it looked in the reference. Then I'll put a brick texture on it and call it a day for now, but later I'll come back to this and add some more granulated ramparts because I felt that it was kind of lacking. For the second scene, I'll import a horse model off of Blender Kit, as well as this knight from Sketchfab. Then after matching the scale, I'll start animating the horse, which I'm not good at animation, so that's for sure the biggest challenge of this scene. At this point, I'm still hoping that I can hide some of the horse animation using this kind of over-the-shoulder camera angle, but a bit later I realized that the camera angle just kind of sucks. I'll also download a saddle and a leash, horse leash name reins. I'll download that and edit it with proportional editing to fit onto the horse. Also changing the knight's posture to sit on the horse instead of just standing there. For the reins, I'll modify them to be near the knight's hands and then hook its top vertices to an empty and then parenting that empty to the knight's hand bones. So that way it will move with his hands and I'll be able to use those vertices as a pin group for a cloth simulation that I'll use to have the rest of the reins move with the hands. But with that, I'll start working on the environment. So first I'll model the path where the horse is going to gallop along and add some more area for the forest surrounding them as well. I'll make the road look sandy by mixing together a few different sand and dirt textures, but I gotta be honest, I'm not happy with how the ground looked in the final render. Now for the forest in the background, I'll import some white spruce and red pine trees that I made using my tree generator, which is gonna be available sometime soon to buy. So if you're interested in that, look out for that, subscribe. But since my tree selection is still quite limited at the moment, I'll also import some other tree types off of Botanique. The forest floor is also looking very empty, so I'll add some grass and fern and rocks and just a lot of different foliage. Now with the lighting, I was kind of struggling because I just couldn't figure out what made it look so bad. But in the end, I was thinking that it should match the first scene I made, so I'll switch to a more foggy, overcast look. And now I'm finally realizing that the camera position just sucks. So I'm experimenting with a few different camera positions and animations. I'm trying to keep the camera stationary and just pan along with the horse, but that wasn't really doing it. So what I settled on was to have the camera move with the horse, but be slightly slower than it, because I don't want it to feel like the camera is perfectly pinned to the horse, because that would look quite CG. Another thing was that the horse animation looked pretty floaty, which I mean, it still kind of does in the final render, but what I did to reduce that was to add a bit of camera shake. After adjusting the camera position, the knight does blend into the background a bit more than I would like. So what I ended up with is to just add a nice backlight, a rim light. It makes it look a lot better and makes him pop out a lot more. Now, the horse. It's looking pretty fake. And the reason is it's got no fur. So I'll just add a hair particle system to it, sculpt them to point backwards, and lastly give them a principled hair BSDF set to Menalin concentration. This is what gives the horse that real nice red hue. For the last scene, I'll just take the finished Stronghold scene, link in the knight and his horse, punch in a lot with the camera, like 300-400 millimeters, and finally light him by placing a big rim light behind him, as well as a light blocker in front of him, because he was just getting lit by a lot of stray light sources that made him look really flat and uncinematic. Then I'll do some composition for the scenes, just adding a bit more fog and mixing in a blurred version of the background into itself for some of the scenes. I'll also do some color grading, which I think for these scenes made a massive difference. This is the first scene, before color grading, after color grading, before color grading, after color grading, before color grading, after color grading. But with that, it's finally done. So here is the final result one more time.